we're talking about different reasons why it makes sense to believe that God exists. So we're talking about arguments in favor of the belief in God. And when we're talking about arguments, we mean giving good reasons, using your reasoning capacity, your rationality, using ideas to prove that something exists. We're using theory, we're using philosophical concepts, we're using logic to support an idea, a belief, the belief that God exists. So when we're arguing about God existing, what we're not doing is saying, I don't care what you say, God exists. We're saying, well, what do you think? What do you say? I'm going to try and use my ideas to convince you otherwise. So arguing about whether God exists does necessitate that we are having a civil and respectful conversation about why or why not it is supportable to believe in God. I'll quickly go over 3 different arguments for the existence of God. The first one is a teleological argument. The teleological argument goes something like this. You start with looking around and seeing that the trees go dormant right before the winter weather, and that there's one animal that eats another animal that eats another animal, and the ecosystem just works well together. You look around and you say, whoa, obviously things have purpose in this world. Obviously there's some kind of design, like the rabbits were designed to eat the vegetables and then get eaten by the coyotes. There seems to be some kind of system. Well, if things have a purpose and a design, then there would have to be a designer. So if they were created to work like this, then there must be a creator. And there you get the idea that God exists, God being the creator, the designer, the one who is giving purpose. And there's people who are for and against that kind of argument for the existence of God. Another kind of argument for the existence of God, which uses what we see in the world, is the cosmological argument for God's existence. And this one says, there is something rather than nothing. Like there didn't have to be humans, but there are. Things exist, and they didn't have to exist. So something other than all the things that we see and all the things that are, something other than what exists, had to cause all the things that exist. Well, that must be something like a being that's powerful enough to make things that's outside of time and all the things in time. And that's where you get an argument for the existence of God, that God would be the causer of things that exist. A third kind of argument for the existence of God works slightly differently. So when you looked at the teleological and the cosmological argument for God, what we're doing is we're using evidence, empirical evidence, and then we are going to draw a theoretical conclusion, namely that God exists, from all of our empirical evidence, making inferences. But the third argument I'll mention, the ontological argument, does not look at evidence and then deduce a theory from that. Instead, the ontological argument starts with our ideas and then uses our other ideas to draw a conclusion, which is another idea. So it's very theoretical, it's very heady, it's very highbrow, it's very a priori, meaning prior to reasoning. And the ontological argument goes something like this. We always talk about God as great, as good, as the greatest thing. So just think about your idea of the greatest being conceivable, fathomable, imaginable. Okay. Well, if that idea was just an idea and not real, it wouldn't be as good as if it was also in your mind and in the world. So that idea of the best, greatest, most amazing, conceivable being, if it were real, would be even better. Well, then it has to be real. Wouldn't the greatest conceivable being necessarily, theoretically, have to be real? God must exist, because if God didn't actually exist, but we can imagine God, then that's not the greatest thing. The greatest thing would be if we could imagine the greatest being and the greatest being existed. So therefore, God must exist, because otherwise we couldn't conceive of the greatest thing. So we have a teleological, a cosmological, and an ontological argument. Each one of these is saying, here is a reason to believe that God exists. And they offer different reasons, but their conclusion is the same. Their conclusion is that God exists. So what we have are three different arguments that God exists. Just because you think God exists does not mean you have to accept one of these arguments. You could think that the ontological argument is bad, but that its conclusion is true. So the conclusion could be true, even though you're denying the argument, and the reverse is true. You could think that that's a great argument. Nice job for coming up with something with all those mental gymnastics, but your conclusion is false. So we can attack the conclusion, we can attack the premises in the arguments, we can attack the whole argument, we can agree with the conclusion, but say the argument's not enough to establish the rationality behind a strong belief in God.